So, good afternoon, everybody, and real compliments to your stamina. It's the 5th day of the festival, and this is the 6th Ethical Reading event. So I decided that a short presentation might be welcome, and if it's a Friday. So this is a brief presentation, and it will be recorded, and I thought I would just explain why I thought how many trees offset a car commute would be an interesting thing to talk about. My name's Jill Ringland, and if we go back, Shweta. Okay, stay on that one. I'm a director of Ethical Reading, and among my particular responsibilities is facilitating the sustainability group in Ethical Reading, and Shweta is one of the volunteers in that group. So thank you, Shweta. Explaining why I thought it was interesting to capture how many trees offset a commute. This was something that had puzzled me for many years. I didn't know whether one tree absorbing CO2 offset a car commute, whether it was 10 trees, whether it was 100 trees, and I couldn't find anybody who would help me do that. Until I was at a conference in Montenegro, and one of the other speakers was a French professor who had done a lot of consultancy work with the Japanese government. And I asked him this question, and he said, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Let's work it out. And so we got out the back of an envelope, and he did a bit of more calling up and checking around after the conference. And so the calculation that I'll be talking about today is in the right ballpark. Obviously, trees differ, car commutes differ, but what we have got is a reasonable estimate of whereabouts on that spectrum from 100 trees to 1 tree a car commute costs. So, Ethical Reading, I just wanted to comment on the photos. Ethical Reading has a number of amazing volunteers, and one of them is a young guy called Callum, and he's excellent at taking nighttime photographs of Reading. And so we include these. He's actually a friend of Catherine's. I can see Catherine looking at the pictures and saying, yes, they are nice. I think they're rather stunning. So we use these to say, Reading, it's a great place. It's not always recognized. So how am I going to structure this talk? In terms of an agenda, we're going to start with something that I'm sure everybody who's on this call is already really familiar with, which is, carbon emissions and global warming, the connections, the sources of emissions. We're going to then focus in on the Reading climate change strategy a bit, and then from there into the role of trees in capturing carbon emissions. And we'll come to an answer about how many trees to offset a car commute. But we'll also come to the conclusion that trees are more than carbon absorbers. They've got a lot of other roles in our lives. And I am going to also use the opportunity to ask for support for our Trees for Reading. We have a crowdfunding campaign going, and I should mention that Trees for Reading is a project that spun out of another volunteer, Willem Londerman, who looked at the centre of Reading and said that the centre of Reading was really rather bare. Why didn't we have more trees there? And so we started this, and so Trees for Reading came out of that. Thinking then about the global picture. Everyone knows, I think, that CO2 has been rising because of man's industrial activities, and the temperature's been rising. And some people say, well, look, it's less than 2 degrees rise since 1880. Well, that's nothing at all. That just means it's a bit nicer in Northern Europe in the summer. Yeah, Northern Europe hasn't been much affected by some of the side effects of this temperature rise. And so that glaciers are directly affected by the temperature increase and are shrinking. and this is causing tremendous disruption to water supplies in China and India. But the indirect effects, the local effects of the rise in temperature are on their weather and the weather patterns, because the sea currents are changing, the air currents are changing. There's a lot of disruption from tornadoes and hurricanes because of these disturbances. Some places are much hotter than they have been, so Australia and California and their wildfires. And of course, in other parts of the world, it's much colder. So in South Africa, for instance, plants that have survived 50 years have been killed by the cold. So it's global temperature, but it's local weather. And it's local weather, which is the thing that is causing most disruption. So it's there. And where does the CO2 come from? Well, this is a global snapshot, comes from Duke University, and it shows that a good proportion of the world's CO2 emissions come from the energy supply. So that's things like mining, generation of electricity from coal, and because it's such a large slab, this is of course where a lot of the focus is on reducing CO2 emissions by replacing coal-fired power stations with renewables or other ways of generating electricity. And it's quite interesting that China has now declared it will be carbon zero, net zero by 2050. And no, not yet, not yet. Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to work all the way around this before we go to the next one. Okay. China is going, aiming to be net zero by 2050, which means that they're going to have to all of a sudden stop building coal-fired power stations, because they're not going to be able to do it unless they can get rid of their coal-fired power stations. Okay. Another big one is forestry, and that surprised me, because I obviously thought that trees absorb CO2, but in fact commercial forestry can be very devastating because of burning forests, because of dead wood, which emits CO2 rather than absorbing it. And there are still very large areas of the world that are forested. So we'll come back to the tree picture later. Agriculture, surprisingly big one. I think most people think it's to do with cows' digestive systems causing all this CO2 emissions, but actually that's only part of it. A lot of it is permafrost releasing, as it warms, releasing CO2, and it's a lot of heat releasing CO2, as well as the use of a lot of chemicals that release CO2 in agriculture. So that's a big sector. And then industry. Industry is about 20%, a fifth of the whole CO2 emissions. And so that's things like concrete making, chemical plants, oil refining. It's a lot of heavy industry. Now, we don't see most of these in Reading. You know, the nearest we had was Didcot Power Station when that was still up. And so in thinking about what Reading can do, we focus very much on the transport and the energy use in residential and commercial buildings. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see what are the action areas that have been adopted by the Reading Climate Strategy. Now, I've put in italics next to each of these bullets the Ethical Reading Festival sessions that we've had on each of these headings, because I think they're a very useful way of finding out what the impact is of these headings on various activities. So the first action area in net zero by 2030 is energy and low carbon development. And we held a session organized by Verity Leal, one of our volunteers, on can planning help tackle climate change? And this talked about the planning laws, and it also talked about how Station Hill is being developed as a low carbon development. And so that's worth catching up on the recording if you're interested in that. And then under transport, the conclusion of the climate strategy is that basically there needs to be a shift in pattern before the transport emissions of CO2 can be reduced. It's not just getting on buses, it's also reducing journeys, and it's also more bike traffic. And so two of our volunteers, Ian Gomer and Rob Hill, are organising a campaign to install secure cycle storage. And they ran an event earlier this week explaining what it was about and what the next steps were. The next heading that Reading can do something about is resources. And so Catherine McCann runs a sustainability business network and held an event about what businesses can do to improve their sustainability. We didn't hold an event on water, flooding and usage, but of course Reading is very subject to flooding now, partly because of a lot of development on floodplains, but also because of the more erratic weather patterns. So it is a local effect of global warming that's brought that very much on the agenda. Then the next heading in the action areas is nature. And nature is about green space and biodiversity. And we're talking today about trees for Reading. And then under the heading of health, Catherine McCann and Natalie Gambat-Singh held a really good event yesterday with a really good discussion around urban trees, well-being and future generations. So Reading is tackling its urban environment with an aim to get to net zero by 2030. And that is a really essential part of what we do. So on the next slide, what I thought we might turn to is just recap on the role of trees in capturing CO2. Now, the World Wildlife Fund estimates that about a sixth of all CO2 emissions come from deforestation. So that's tropical forests that are being cut down. There is also a different view or an additional view of the importance of trees in the Trillion Tree 20 vision. Now, this is a vision about trees, but it's driven from biodiversity. So it's the World Wildlife Fund, the BirdLife International, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, is that 1 trillion trees have been regrown or saved from loss and better protected around the world. And that is a really good vision and one I really think is worth thinking about. Now, all this assumes that trees are a good thing. And what has happened recently is that because there are a lot of satellites available, scientists have been able to start doing atmospheric studies that actually look at detailed CO2 absorption rates and flows around various sorts of forests and trees. And of course, their numbers disagree in detail. As you would expect. But here's one calculation that compares an average absorption of from a tree in a mature environment, urban environment, temperate environment with an average car commute. Now, car commute. We guessed, and the numbers from the travel data bear this up, that an average commute for Reading is 10 kilometres each way, 6 miles each way. That's Theale into the centre or the centre into Theale. And there's a lot of commuting in and around Reading. Now, of course, this may change. One of the effects of COVID has been that people have started working at home. And so that if we're talking here about working 200 days a year in an office, what we might want to do if people only started working 40 days a year or 50 days a year in an office, obviously we can scale down. So this calculation is about 200 days a year, commuting 20 kilometers a day. So that makes 4,000 kilometers a year. And then we thought about a typical car. Well, there are electric cars, there are diesel cars, there are petrol cars. A typical car could well be something like a 1300cc petrol car. And this emits 130 grams of CO2 per kilometre, average, if it's in good condition. And so this means that a commuter person produces about 500 kilograms of CO2 per year. So keep that number, that's 500 kilograms. Now, then we start to think about trees. Now, in New York, there was a study recently. In fact, this is a number stolen from Catherine's event yesterday, that New York City trees absorb about 50 kilograms of CO2 per year. Well, you know, New York always has to be bigger and better than everyone else. What our calculations think is about 20 to 30 kilograms of CO2 per year. So say 25. So if we take this 500 and we divide it by 25, it gets about 20 trees to compensate for the emissions of 1 year's commute. Okay, so obviously it depends on the size of tree, the leaf type, etc. But 20 is a number to focus on. So it's not one tree will offset one commuter. It's not 100 trees are needed to offset one commuter. It's in between, and 20 is a good number to keep in mind. Now, what this leads us to is understanding that planting trees alone is not going to absorb all of Reading's commuter emissions. There just isn't enough space for that number of trees. And so the Tree for Reading campaign, which I'm about to talk about, is focusing on all sorts of other impacts of trees other than the CO2 emission, CO2 absorption. CO2 absorption, yes, and the others. So what is this Trees for Reading campaign? Well, it's the idea that organizations sometimes have money, or people have money, and would like more trees in Reading and the surrounding areas. Other organizations have land, but they don't have the wherewithal to plant trees. And so we have been working with Reading Borough Council and the tree wardens to plant trees in central Reading. So we launched in November 2019 with Councillor Karen Rowland, who planted the first tree. That's her picture there. And you can see the trees. On our website, there's a map showing where the trees are. Some of them are by Thames Lido, because Thames Lido invented a really ingenious scheme of charging their customers to park in their car park and putting the money to Trees for Reading. So the first group of 3 trees are by Thames Lido. We have a tree by the town hall, which is a special tree because it's a place for foster children to meet. When they have been fostered away from Reading, they can connect together at the tree by the town hall. There are a number of other trees around the centre of Reading that we planted in the first season. And shortly, there will be trees at the plaza side of the Reading station and also the north side. And so when we think about these trees, yes, they will have an impact on air quality. Yes, they will have an impact on biodiversity. Yes, they will have an impact on ambience. And in terms of well-being, there was a very interesting session earlier in the festival by Professor Elizabeth Robinson at the University of Reading, who has done an analysis of the connection between health and climate change in Reading. It's the first time this sort of analysis has been done on a local basis, and it's really worth going and checking out that presentation. It's really good. Okay. So if you would like to find out more about the Trees for Reading campaign, please do go to the website. The link's at the bottom. So, as well as programs like Trees for Reading, what we do in Ethical Reading is provide services. The common theme behind all these services is a strong ethical culture leading to improved health and well-being. It's all about making Reading a better place to live and work. And so some of these services turn out to have been very prescient in their timing. So for instance, as COVID and lockdown has taken its toll, the courses on well-being and mental health are very much ones that people look to for help in dealing with what is a really strange situation. I wanted also to point out that we've got some services around sustainability. We have an online learning set of modules that are developed by our partner Earth 51, and they're based on the United Nations Sustainability Goals, and they provide a really excellent work-through that's a basis for deciding what an organization or a person might do. So have a look at the services on our website. Then a call to action. Join us. These are the ways that you can join us. You can come to our events. You can, please, thank you. You can come to our events. You can sign up to our newsletter. You can replay the recorded events on YouTube. You can explore the services catalogue. You can follow us on any of the various social media. We've put here a nearly up-to-date list of our partners and supporters, and we would love to have you join as a partner. Please get in touch. And the link at the bottom is for our crowdfunder campaign for Trees for Reading. We've just launched this, and what I've decided to do is that since I'm in lockdown, I can't go to the gym. I can't get my hair cut. Both of those would have cost me money this month. Instead, I'm going to give that money to Trees for Reading crowdfunder campaign. And that means that it'll have a much longer lasting effect than my lack of a haircut. So I'd like to encourage everyone to think the same of what they've saved this month by being in lockdown and contribute to Trees for Reading. Then I think that's about done.